All right. I am live right now with a big deal. Best-selling author, historian, award-winning journalist. His new book is really interesting and very relevant, even though you could call it a history book. American Nations is the name. He's also the founder of the Nationhood Lab, and it's his first time here on Stand Up, so I'll be very gentle with you, sir. Really an honor to have you. Colin Woodard, welcome to Stand Up. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks much. It's a pleasure.
You've been on this kind of beat for a while since you wrote this book back in 2011, and I think that that was, I'm sorry, American Nations. Your new book is Nations Apart, and I'll throw that up on the screen, and everybody's got to buy it right now. It comes out at the beginning of November. It's so good. Tell us a little bit about the story that you've been telling about our nation for over a decade and why it's important.
Yeah, I guess the fundamental thing is that the United States isn't a nation state at all, that we're better understood as a federation of stateless nations, as it were, of separate regional cultures, which have a lot of analogies to being, nations and having nationhood. And the reason for that is that the different colonial projects that started on the eastern and southern rims of what's now the United States, they were founded at different times by totally different groups of people who had different, religious and ethnographic characteristics and political aims, in some cases belonged to different empires. And they never thought that they were going to be in one country together. You had, the Puritans in New England, of people who thought that they were like in a covenanted relationship with God, like the Old Testament Hebrews, and that they had been sent to the New World to accomplish certain things as a group, and they would be, punished or rewarded as a group for those things. And so you have, people with a mission done through their shared institutions, and then you had, the English people at the same time colonizing the Chesapeake country, what I call the Tidewater, who were the lesser sons of like the big, manor owning country, nobility families in England, the second and third and fourth and fifth sons who weren't going to inherit the estate. And yet suddenly with the, discovery of the New World, there was the possibility that they could create a new manor estate. So they were all going there to like recreate the, manor system of the English countryside, to create like little Downton Abbeys, be Lord Granthams and have that kind of society. Or, the Dutch settled the area around what's now New York City as a global commercial like city state, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, about commerce and trade in a way that no other city or part of the continent it is. There were, West Indies planters from Barbados who in the 1670s ran out of land and took a fully developed West Indies style, like horror show slave society, and redeployed it, expanded it to the subtropical lowlands of the New Carolina colony. And the Spanish project in the Southwest, south to north, and the people from the borderlands of, lowlands of Scotland where Braveheart was from, and the English marches, and Northern Ireland, people who'd been in this war-torn environment where you had to protect your kith and kin yourself, and you couldn't trust institutions or the government because the government was going to come mow your family down with lances, who, settled the whole section of the backcountry, and so on. That each of these are totally different projects. And once you understand that, and the areas which they colonized, which were kind of in these mutually exclusive strips out through the 1840s, lots of things start making sense, from our constitutional arrangements to our, county level election maps and tons of other things.
It really does. I mean, you explained it very well right there. And looking at the map is fascinating, and reading the book and all of your work is really helpful to understand, because I think a lot of people think of North and South and other regional differences, but they certainly don't understand, I don't, most of the history, as well as how it animates us today. So give me an example, using any of those or any others, of how any of those settlers, if you will, in these regional cultural differences, geographical differences, affect today's politics. Prove it, sir. I dare you.
Everything, not just politics, but health, life expectancy, attitudes towards gun violence, environment, immigration. They all track, if you map salient things and data, which is what I do at Nationhood Lab, you will see the county level settlement patterns on the maps today. For instance, they disagree. One of the big things that the regional cultures separate on is how do you execute the American experiment in trying to create a society where people can be, individuals can be free as possible, sustainably over time. And do you do it through maximizing individual liberty, like have each individual have as little as much autonomy as possible, to not be constrained by government or anything else? Low taxes, low regulations, would, and less government would axiomatically make the individual more free? Or do you think you need to build and maintain like a free society, right? That the only way that humans have been able to be free after 5,000 years of despotisms was that we built all these structures and infrastructure to make that possible. That in order for each person to have a shot at being free, you have to have the leveling mechanisms, these days, highways and schools and health clinics and all the stuff that makes that possible, so that power doesn't accrete to a few families who maximize their freedom and, kill anyone who gets in the way.
Yeah.
So if you know that, those are both quests to achieve human freedom, but with opposite policy implications. And all of our elections had, back into, the 1700s, the 1800s, you had one party that was arguing on the individualism side and one on the more communitarian side. And you can see in almost every hotly contested presidential election in our history, you can see at a county level, the regions break out. And I keep mentioning county level because these settlement patterns, these rival colonial projects, didn't respect state or international boundaries, oftentimes because those states and boundaries didn't exist yet. So you need to know the actual geography, which explains why, there are 3 Ohios and 3 north-south strips, why the coast of California and the southern part and the interior don't get along, why Texans know that Austin's the state capital, but that Houston and Dallas and San Antonio are the hubs of 3 different Texases. It's because they were colonized by separate projects.
It matters so much. I've learned so much. I feel so much smarter reading your book and looking at your work, preparing for this interview. You laid it out perfectly about these long-term differences in terms of the individual versus community. And I think the way that you set it up is the argument over freedom. And I feel like, well, who defines what freedom is? And more importantly, given your work and your nation, what is it, the lab that you...
Nationhood Lab, nationhoodlab.org, which is at the Pell Center at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island.
So I feel like, given your work, you're not betraying your personal opinion here in this conversation because you're setting it up, but your work does say that the way towards freedom is towards investing in community. And it doesn't seem like a hard question unless you buy into an anecdote or a theory. If you have all the resources and a lot of money, you don't need community as much because you can afford your own security service, right, or whatever you want. Your own well with your own water and your own energy plant and so on. But that doesn't help the rest of humans in this case establish what we would define as any kind of freedom. And you could look at any policy. And so you do have a pretty strong opinion on which way is the better pathway to quote freedom.
Well, if you step way back, there's a couple books in between these 2 books. One's American Character, which just focused specifically on this struggle in American history between individual liberty and the common good. And the central argument is that in any society, if you run to the individualism side to the extreme or the communitarian common good side to the extreme, you're going to end up in tyranny, right? One of them is going to end up with, a society where there's no government or referee of any kind, and the most successful or rapacious families will maximize their freedom and, kill or enslave everyone else, like happened in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador in the late 20th century, where the 7 families or the 10 families always capitalized, owned, the police, the army, the land, and, knocked off anyone else until they were so weak that the drug cartels were able to push them aside. So that's bad, right? You don't want to live in an oligarchy. But if you go in the other direction, you end up with, George Orwell, right? Where individuals have no rights or freedom of thought, that it's all about obeying the dictates of whoever's supposedly governing in the common good. You end up with Stalin and Hitler. So that's bad, right? So if they're both bad, what do you do? Well, logically, somewhere in the middle is this equilibrium point where these 2 essential aspects of freedom, right? Individuals' liberty and the good of the broader community, that the community be free, are in balance. It's a 50-yard line problem. And of course, conditions are always changing. humans have only, for 5,000 years, we had despotisms, like I said, and only for the past few centuries have we been trying to create this sort of, Western democracy or liberal democracy, small l, small d, where the quest is for individuals to be as free as possible. We're not very good at it, and it's finding the balance point. So your question was, in today's United States, all the data and the history shows that we have slid so far off the 50-yard line into the individualism side that we've completely destabilized society. And I think people know that. Both the Tea Party and the Occupy movement were both reactions to, the fact that taxpayers were going to bail out AIG, that reinsurance conglomerate that had, helped bring down the world economy. And suddenly everyone learned that we were going to pay the bonuses of the execs as we bailed out the company. That's the moment that both of those things flared up. So it's,
although I will say, I will quibble a tiny bit because I covered the Tea Party very specifically and attended a lot of them for both CNN and SiriusXM. And my conclusion, and happy to have you disagree, but my conclusion was the Tea Party rise, all of that stuff about government and bailouts and overspending was nonsense. It was that a black man had won and they wanted to take America back. That was the old phrase before it was make America great again. Take it back from who? All of a sudden, overnight, and the real causes of the financial crisis was the deregulation of the financial industry. You didn't have to be a student of any subject to know that, but it depended on what narrative that you wanted to eat. And I just feel like the whole rise of the Tea Party, which gave birth to Trump, of course, was not as a result of the bailouts or any other government role, government being bigger, but more as a result of the progressive movement, the culture wars, electing a black president, gay people, everything we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, my analysis has been in looking at the stuff that other people studied is that the Tea Party in 2010 was this unstable alliance between two things: what you're describing, right, and a ethno-nationalist or maybe white supremacist or some kind of ethno-national component upset by the things you're describing, fused in this uneasy alliance with a libertarian project that was concerned about the bailouts and all of that. But the animus, the fire was that caused it to flare up at that moment was that financial crisis and those bailouts. And so the Koch brothers, tried to capture the movement's energy with some success, jumping in there and trying to organize the different Tea Party groups towards the libertarian cause. That kind of died though, right? So I mean the surviving component which pulled into Trumpism is absolutely as you described. If you go to the genealogy of what of the Tea Party has affected our present, that's absolutely true, but it had this other chunk that got horrified by the ethno-nationalist group and ended up leaving. And in the regions, the proportion who were one or the other was very different in the various regions.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. One more thing about the Tea Party. Just reacting to what you said. The Koch brothers, you said, kind of came in. My recollection, the journalism I remember was the Koch brothers created the Tea Party. The word astroturf. First time I heard astroturf instead of like grassroots. They organized and funded the actual gatherings and had all kinds of ad campaigns and election campaigns. So it did not come from the bottom up of people being outraged. And then my other final point was, you're right, I think, about the fusion of the libertarian movement and the kind of anti-government, big government movement. But again, went to all those, no people of color. So let's just, but we could talk about that forever. I want to get back to your book because I certainly don't quibble with much. I can pretend to make the interview more provocative, but I really don't. I'm really reading it as a student. And I think, I don't want to fast forward to today because, you don't need to. You can look into history and prove what I'm going to ask you. How did we get here? You mentioned the 5,000 years of, human civilization and despotism, and then the few hundred years of democracy. Well, that was a nice ride, Colin. Professor, that was a good couple hundred years. This idea of we the people and us, democracy in general, because it would seem that authoritarianism is back, baby, around the world, including here. And you could go back and cite things like the Great Replacement Theory, which apparently is not new.
Yeah, no, I mean, our struggle since the beginning in this country, the battle for the soul of the country has always been between, a vision that what makes an American is a devotion to the set of ideals in the Declaration, right? That each person has an intrinsic right handed by the universe or God to, to survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue your happiness as you understand it, and to access the representative self-government that makes it possible, and that we're all in a covenant. We're all tasked with protecting one another's rights to those things. That's one interpretation. And there was instantly, at the same time that that idea was put forward in the 1830s, there was a counter story. It came out of the Deep South and Tidewater that said, no, Jefferson and the Declaration are wrong. People are not created equal. In fact, the only people who could realize the promises in the Declaration are the members of the superior Anglo-Saxon race, was the first thing. And that we are the ethno-states of the Anglo-Saxon race, and everyone else is here provisionally. That we're a classical republic like ancient Greece and Rome, where at the top of the pyramid are a small group of people who have the liberty or privilege to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. That's how the ancient Greece and Rome worked, and they had 2,000 years of political philosophy and history behind them. That was the fight. That was the fight in the antebellum period that tore the country apart. That was the fight in the Civil War and in Reconstruction and in Southern Redemption and in the Jim Crow era and in the Civil Rights era. And it's the struggle today. I mean, Vice President Vance was just out recently in a speech at the Claremont Institute saying, America is not just a country of ideals. We're a particular people and culture with a particular heritage. Right. And our ancestors, I will stress ancestors, are the ones who tamed a wild continent, right? And that's our American heritage, right? That's inherently the people who are doing the colonizing between 1604 and when the frontier closed in 1890. That excludes indigenous people whose ancestors were enslaved, and also anyone whose ancestors came after about 1880 or 1885, which is the almost entirely the non-Protestant migration groups, the great Catholic, Jewish, Orthodox Christian, East Asians into the left coast region immigration wave that so transformed the country from being, legacy and, aggressively Protestant in its identity to being broader than that. And he's saying, he's delineating who really belongs in an exclusive fashion, in ethno-nationalist fashion.
By the way, you mentioned J.D. Vance, the vice president, and his comments at Claremont Institute. And I just heard yesterday someone referred to the president, Trump. He often refers to Christians in the third person. Had you ever picked up on that? He says they. Did I freeze or did Colin freeze? Somebody froze. Anyway, are you back?
Wheels. Yep, you're back now.
Okay. Did you hear my non sequitur about Trump referring to Christians in the third person?
I hadn't heard that. No, I thought I heard it being indigenous people in the third person, but
that too. No, but I was just listening. I think it was a New York Times podcast yesterday, and they were talking about Russ Vought specifically being a very religious guy, and they mentioned that Trump often says they in reference to Christians, belying the fact that he's not one. Worth just mentioning. I don't know if you have any comment on that. I can get to. I thought this was the easiest way to do this book, this interview, was I could actually, the cheat to talk about your amazing new book, Nations Apart, is to mention an issue that we're dealing with or divided over today. And you can go back and talk about the cultural and historical influence of it. For example, the political divide on climate change that shows huge differences amongst people like in the Deep South and Greater Appalachia and other parts of the country. And you could argue the science around vaccines as well. I suppose you could lump in. I'm guessing there's an overlap there. So what's that about?
Survival of the COVID-19, pandemic. If you look at a county level maps, like the New York Times produced one right after the pandemic started, that was of, when the only advice was, oh my God, we don't know what's going on. Everyone stop moving so you don't spread the disease. And, where did they got cell phone data, anonymous cell phone data of.
Oh, damn. Come on back to me, Colin.
How stopped and who didn't. And we seem to have an unstable connection, unfortunately, which is unusual here.
Probably my fault. You there?
Yeah, it may just be where, yeah.
I mean, you're a writer who lives in Maine, and I'm a professional broadcaster in New York. It would be embarrassing if it were my fault, but I think it might be, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, we'll somehow overcome it. I have no idea what to do at this point, but it's. Do you have me now? Damn it!
Working, you heard.
I'm gonna end this stream and try to get it fixed back up. For people watching live, I apologize. For people listening on tape, I will be fixed and you'll never know what happened. But I'll try to come back with you. If not, you can listen to the rest of this conversation like a lot of broadcasters do. They tease it and say you should have to pay for it. It's free. Everything I do is not behind a paywall, everything. And so you can join us there. But you know what? You're back. I'm gonna not end it. I'm gonna try to keep going. What about gun
It was
violence?
a temporary glitch.
It's what?
Hopefully it was a temporary glitch.
Hopefully it was a temporary glitch. I guess I didn't get the full answer on climate change.
Yeah, I will just say that I just received a text message from Xfinity, my internet provider, saying we've identified a network performance issue that may be affecting your account. So there you go, right? It was not you. It's the ISP. Yeah,
let's do
it's happening right here during your live stream, but yeah, it's neither of our faults.
No worries. I'm psyched to have you, and we'll fix it in post. But getting back to that question about climate change and regional differences, I think I lost most of that, Colin. If you can try one more time.
Yes,
Science.
I mean climate change, science, I mean all of those things. That if you look at environmental policies in the different states controlled by different regional cultures, they all fall on the predictable lines, right? The communitarian regions where you're concerned about the common good. I mean, the environment is your classic, common good versus individualism problem. And in the regions that are more individualistic, they tend to want less environmental regulation, that to free up each individual or company to be able to do what they want. And that plays out in assessments at the state level and how the congressional delegations vote in attitudes. If you poll on various environmental issues, where is the most doubt about climate change, in the deep south and tidewater, and to some degree far west, where's the most support for doing something about climate change in left coast and Yankeedom. But even more pronounced, we had this life or death crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic where the region.
Damn it. I was making the same point that he made earlier and got cut off. I smell a conspiracy because both times you tried to make the point about regional differences in COVID vaccines and deaths, I think both times is when you got. I don't believe in any of these conspiracies, though. So I hear you, though. You were going to say those regions.
We'll try one more time on it. I mean, the regional differences right down to the county level on, during COVID at the beginning when you needed to stop moving. Cell phone data was, tracked by the New York Times, anonymous cell phone data. And basically everyone kept moving in the deep south and Tidewater and greater Appalachia. Everyone stopped across Yankeedom and the Midlands and the left coast, which are the communitarian nations. You fast forward to when vaccines were available. By August 2021, anyone who wanted to get vaccinated could have been by then. And again, the vaccination rates in the northern regions were sometimes approaching double that of some of them in the individualistic regions. And then the deaths that summer, staggering differences following the lack of vaccination rates. And by the end of the pandemic, 2023, the Deep South lost, 250,000 people to COVID-19 at a per capita rate, 2.5 times that of the northeastern greater New England cultural space. And, I think it was 4 or 5 times that of Hawaii, which is part of greater Polynesia culturally, but offers a control because Hawaii is an island and they could actually, to a large extent, seal themselves off, and it gives you a sense of what might have been possible. So that's, gun control is the same thing with communitarianism versus individualism. We ran the per capita gun deaths and gun homicides and gun suicides data by county and then sorted into the regions, and enormous differences. 2, 3, 4-fold differences between the regions, again, following that, is it most important to you that the individual's rights to bear and use arms is protected, or that the community is kept safe? Again, a classic common good versus individual liberty argument. They fall on those lines, and so do the death rates and the, and beyond that, capital punishment and executions and all kinds of things.
Well, you mentioned death rates, and of course, I'm talking to Colin Woodard, a best-selling author, journalist, and researcher, historian. A lot of hats. I think he could be described as. It's not the olden days. It's Nations Apart is his new book, How Clashing Regional Cultures Shattered America, and he's been writing about this issue for a long time. Chapter what is health and survival, and in this book, and in this chapter, you take a look at life expectancy by region and health outcomes. It's fascinating. Say a bit about what you learned and write about in this chapter of Nations.
Yeah, and it all again track to the, is your regional culture communitarian or individualistic? And because the individualistic ones tend to want to have low taxes and low regulations and fewer services and less government. So there's less, regulation in insurance and in healthcare. There's less infrastructure available and provisions for, poor people and children. And then you look at almost anything, county rates and regional rates of per capita diabetes, obesity, disabilities, COVID-19 survival, preventable oral health problems, arthritis. We went through tons of them, myself and scientific partners I work with who are public health experts at the University of Illinois Chicago and the Health Partners Institute in Minnesota. We've done 27 scientific papers in as many months showing all these things that have gone through peer review. I mean, like this is real data, and it shows it again and again. For instance, life expectancy. We found 3 to 5 year population level differences in life expectancy between the regions, which might not sound like a lot, but 3 to 5 years is the difference between the United States and Bulgaria or the Philippines. I mean, those are big numbers, and it didn't go away if you controlled for the wealth of the county, its ruralness or urbanness, whether or not there was good access to healthcare or not by various metrics. In fact, one of the most stunning stats was we took the very poorest counties. Like if you had if your county was in the bottom quartile of all U.S. counties for income in the entire United States and happened to be in the Deep South, for instance, we would compare it to the poorest quintile of counties in Yankeedom, compare very poor counties to each other. And the gaps remained. The crazy part was the richest counties in the Deep South, the ones that are in the top quarter of all counties in the United States that happen to be in the Deep South, had a lower life expectancy than the bottom quartile of American counties that happen to be in the greater New England cultural space, which goes New England, upstate New York, Western Reserve of Ohio, and the upper Great Lakes states. Higher in the poor counties that happen to be in that region than in the richest ones.
That might be one of the most fascinating statistics I've heard, which is why it begs all kinds of it's dying for ridicule and criticism. You've done a clear amount of data research on this, so it should be mentioned that you probably are pretty confident with that assertion. But what is the reason? That's effing crazy.
Well, we know that those are the numbers and the answer. The region, this is going to be informed speculation, but it stands to reason that if you have a society where there are fewer social supports, less investment in infrastructure, less regulation of insurance companies, where you don't expand Medicare or Medicaid, where you're on your own person, survive, sink or swim on your own, or you're in a society where, hey, the person who's vulnerable, the poor person, we provide services to make sure that you get a checkup, and that when you were, in the womb, your mom was able to get prenatal care, and that you have provisions for there to be school lunches and all those kind of things. Those interventions actually matter a great deal, and so you accumulate those over time. If you have one society that's making those social infrastructure investments and another that's not, the outcomes for most people diverge very quickly, almost no matter what you're looking at.
Is there anything I feel like I was reading about Medicaid and who gets it and what happens when they lose it kind of thing, and there's this strain of people who live in rural America, let's say poor white folks in general, who are less likely to even see a doctor. And I want to say it's some kind of cultural feeling one way or another about healthcare. I don't want to make any assumptions about poor Black folks in the city or gender differences, men and women, but there's a question about accessing healthcare. And I believe this idea is, I'm going to tough it out. I live far from a doctor. I don't trust them. I can't afford it anyway. So whatever the issue with my tooth or anything else is, I'm just not seeing it. And then they die,
Yeah.
or they go bankrupt with insurance costs because it's too late to get treated, et cetera. Is there any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are cultural components to that in different regional cultures. The distrust of institutions or the trust in institutions and expertise are different. The idea that you got to solve your problems yourself. Don't rely on others. That far western Greater Appalachian thing will lead to those things, but probably the more important driver is, you know, do you have insurance or not? Because I've had times in my life where I didn't have insurance, and you bet you avoid seeing a doctor or anything unless it's absolutely desperate because you can't afford to have the bill. And the in some of the states and places like Yankeedom and the left coast, the ability for someone who's completely broke to go to a nonprofit hospital and their care will basically be written off or covered, or they'll be enrolled into the state's Medicaid program automatically. That will happen and avoid debt in a crisis, whereas that doesn't happen in other regions where those things aren't available. So that right there, what's the chance that you'll be able to take your kid and not go bankrupt if you don't have any money and don't have any insurance? They're going to be very different depending on where you live. That it's all an outcome of, the culture. Health is kind of downstream from culture because culture begats the ideologies and values of the dominant ethos of a region, and that translates to the kind of politics and people you have in there, which implement policy, which create these social determinants of health, which is what we're kind of talking about.
We are, but the whole rest of the world provides universal. The whole rest of the civilized, OECD developing countries have universal health insurance of some form or another. And when you travel, it's one of the things that they focus on. And being close to Canada, if you know any Canadians, obviously their healthcare has been demagogued and it's not perfect, but they would never trade places overwhelmingly with us. So what influences historically do you identify in this or any of your work that has brought Americans to a place where they literally argue out loud, I shouldn't have to pay for your health insurance, when in fact, the whole idea of insurance is that everybody's in the pool, which brings down the cost. If some are and some aren't, it doesn't work. But America is very unique in its for-profit health insurance system that does not cover everybody. So access, affordability, or quality are all the debatable characteristics about any health insurance, but access is not nearly the issue in the rest of the world that it is here. Why? Is it the Puritans?
Well, the Puritans would probably be okay with that, right? They're a covenanted people on a mission, and their collective will provide a taxpayer-financed public school straight out of the box, and probably all those other services if they feel that you can't execute the mission unless your troops are healthy, right? so they probably do it. But it's the fact that we have these strongly individualistic, individual liberty regional cultures that have had an enormous impact on our evolution. For instance, Canada. There's another federation in North America, colonized by, these European colonization drives, but they don't have the individualistic. They have some far west, but that's the relatively mild form in Alberta and Manitoba and, sections of their interior, but they don't have a greater Appalachia. They don't have a deep south. They don't have a tidewater or a legacy of human slavery directly. What they have is a mix of fairly communitarian regions like we have, plus a really communitarian one in the New France, the Quebec and parts of the French shore of New Brunswick and elsewhere, which is very much a common good kind of society. So the mix is completely different, and it results in them having, considered that healthcare should be a national or a shared project, as do most countries in Europe in the aftermath of World War II, adopting those same things. Again, they don't have the same individual liberty ethos forming a dramatic, and chunky part of their electorates, and therefore their results.
It's interesting that you say that about French Canada, because the World Health Organization says France's healthcare system is considered the best in the world, according to however they measure such things. One of my smart friends, who's a historian himself, pseudo historian, maybe not a pro. His name is Bill Boyle. In the chat, he said, "Pete, our problem wasn't the Puritans. It was the Roundheads and the Cavaliers." I think he's trying to impress you. I don't know what he's talking about.
That's the English Civil War. So in the 1640s, not long after colonization started, there was the major upheaval in the whole English, future British Empire. And that was, a war essentially, I see it as a war between sorts of forces of modernity who, proto-capitalists, let's break down the guilds, let's have more human freedom and more ability to, produce stuff in our factories. And that was dominated by East Anglia, the parts of England that were closest to the Netherlands, that had the most, people who owned their land outright, who were freeholders, who had the most little proto-capitalists, factories and stuff. And they were up against the royalists, who were devoted to the old way of doing things, right? J.R.R. Tolkien, King Arthur, divine right of kings, and guilds and castles, and everyone knows their place and in their fiefs and their peons and stuff. There was the clash in the early modern world, 1640s, between those two forces. Massive civil war, tons of people died, and the colonies back, the separate colonies took different allegiances. Clearly the product, the Puritans aligned with the Roundheads and Cromwell and that movement, where many of them had come from, and other regions of the country did not. In fact, the end of the English Civil War resulted in a great many of the royalists lost. The king lost, and he lost his head, and they had a brief republic under Cromwell, which had its own problems. But when the king lost his head and the royalists lost, that caused thousands of cavaliers, of the people loyal to the royalist side, who tended to be aristocrats and members of these manor estates, to move to the Tidewater and start trying to create and recreate that society of the countryside. So yeah, you immediately had a royalists versus cavaliers reprise on the eastern coast of the future United States that tracks back to the English Civil War. I mean, these things go back, like, think about it. Those two English colonies in the 1640s were already on opposite sides of the great, geostrategic conflict of that age. And, it hasn't gotten better since.
Just to be clear, for the sake of this conversation, when you refer to English colonies or any colonies, you're talking about in the then American colonies.
The English colonies in what's now the United States. In the 1640s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you would have had, there's the Dutch presence around New York City, and there were Spanish colonies in the Southwest and in Florida, but the Virginia colony, the New England colonies, eventually the Pennsylvania, Quaker utopian experiments that William Penn set up around the shores of Delaware Bay. But those were the English colonies as opposed to their rivals, French, Dutch.
Do we like William Penn? He's got my life insurance policy. Is he someone that he must be someone to celebrate?
He must lasting grip, right? Yeah. So William Penn, that's a whole nother regional culture, our big swing region, the Midlands. And yeah, like the Puritans were Calvinists, right? In the end, they thought that humans are depraved and can't be trusted, so we got to watch out for each other so that the devil doesn't, start, messing with us.
My understanding was the only thing I know about Calvinism, and I may be wrong, but my understanding is, like, what I read about the Koch brothers or their family, their dad was a Calvinist, and I thought their belief, Calvinist, is that you are born into a class. You're born poor. You're born rich.
Right.
What's it called?
Well, I mean, for the Puritans, it was for a while, it was predestination, meaning whether or not you'll be saved in the afterlife has already been determined and is unknowable to you, which just created enormous anxiety where everyone is trying to at least act like they're part of the select, the elect who will be chosen at the pearly gates. But that's a really distressing thing, to think that it's already been decided and you have no power over it.
Yeah.
But the Quakers, William Penn, totally different. They were the dissident radicals at that time period. We're talking the 1650s, 60s, 70s. They believed that humans are fine. There's an inner light. We're all good in the end. And that one of the most important ramifications of that was that they had in Pennsylvania and the Delaware counties an open immigration policy at a time when the other colonies were very strict about who could and couldn't come. And that meant that they had huge numbers of people who weren't English, right? Germans and Scots-Irish, the people who founded Greater Appalachia, and Swiss people and Belgians, and we're all just pouring in. Many of them Catholics, and they weren't all Quakers by any means. It was a tiny minority, and a lot of the people were fleeing oppression back where they were from. So they got these groups of Amish and Mennonites, and later the 1848ers, and fleeing the collapse of the democratic revolutions in Germany that failed in the mid 19th century. And they all came, and the Quakers were like, well, we're not in charge. Come here and you can keep your culture. Like, you want to come and like set up your German village just like you had back in the state of Hesse or wherever you're from. Go right ahead. Keep your church, have your newspaper, teach your kids in that dialect of German. That's fine. And next door there'll be another village where everyone's Danish, or there'll be the Amish village next door where they're all doing their thing. It was like, and it still is, the model is a mosaic, right? You come, you bring your culture, and you keep your culture, and we all share a common polity, but not a common culture. There's no group in charge. That's very different than like the Yankee Puritan ethos was the melting pot. You can come here and work at our factory, thank you very much, but you have to become like us.
Right.
You have to be melted and assimilate into the whole. Which still, if you come to New England, I'm from Maine, and you move here, you'll feel this pressure, especially in rural areas, to become like us, right? You won't be accepted for generations.
I think it's fascinating to just examine the psychology around that with ourselves and which kind of person we are. Are you more of a Quaker or the other categories of people that you talk to, and where does that come from? All right, well, I know I've taken up so much of your time. Let me just ask you about the final chapter of the book, which is optimistic, holding the country together. Again, there's the book. It's out early November. People should order it. It's a fascinating read, and Colin is proving to be a great guest to just talk about this stuff. It's so important and relevant, which is why I think it's important we talked about the final chapter. So you offer as much optimism as you can based on what you know and have learned in your study of history. What are we going to do? Aren't we doomed?
Yeah, well, the path for, what holds us together at this point? If you had these separate regional cultures and there's all these divides now, and it seems like the country's on verge of civil war or collapse into authoritarianism, what do we do about it? Do we share anything in common? How have we ever held this together, given that this has been true since the colonial period? And the answer is that if you're a federation, and when this country came together in an accident of history in the 1770s, it was that the British imperial policy in London, the king wanted all these colonies to conform. I don't want your idiosyncratic way of doing things. You do it my way or else. And that threatened the local cultures and power bases of each of these colonies. So they rose up on this ragtag alliance to protect each of their own ways of doing things. And whoa, they won. They defeated the British Empire, but that meant they found themselves in something called the United States of America together, and nobody knew what that was. Is this a NATO alliance? Is this like the European Union? Are we creating a nation state like Prussia or Japan? Nobody was sure, and it was ambiguous all the way into the 1830s when, by that time, like New England had almost seceded during the War of 1812, and whole chunks of Appalachia in the 1794 had risen up in arms to create their own country and leave the United States. There were all of, the fact that slavery was not withering away as the founders thought it would, but in fact that the deep Southern and Tidewater oligarchy were arguing that slavery is a good, in fact, a positive good, and that everyone who's poor should be enslaved everywhere. Like the tensions were tearing the country apart. And it was clear to everyone by the 1830s that the Federation would collapse if they didn't come up with an answer, not what makes you a South Carolinian or a Massachusettsian, what does it mean to be a United Statesian? And so the story mattered a ton, and there was a battle over that story. And that battle was between that ethno-national vision I described earlier, that we're the homeland of the blank people, Anglo-Saxon race,
right,
white Protestants, whatever it is, versus the ideals in the Declaration. So fast forward to now, we're still in that battle. And the proponents of that ethno-national model, the J.D. Vance version of things, have their story worked out. They've created a motive set of messaging that has moved tens of millions of Americans to a place they didn't used to be. But our polling and effort, we're like, well, what is the alternative story? What is anyone even talking about the ideals-based story of who we're supposed to be tied to the Declaration? No one even knows how to express it anymore. So we went and spent, 2 years doing polling and interviewing people from the polls and in-depth interviews and developing a sort of core narrative strategy. And what we discovered in the polling is, like people given a choice between sort of a very nice sounding heritage, legacy, intrinsic qualities definition of who we are and the ideals based one, they prefer the ideals based one, like, 60-40. And that's like across regions, parties, genders, education levels. The only people who don't have a majority supporting that are Republicans or people who said they voted for Trump in 2020. But in both of those groups, 45% of them prefer the civic version. And when you just ask people outright, like, hey, do you agree or disagree that as Americans, we are tasked with protecting one another's rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? That we're in a covenant? I was like, well, will that be 60-40? I don't know. I mean, it would be nice if people agreed. Blew my mind. The results came back. It was 97-2 in favor of that proposition. You never see 97-2 on any question. Like our pollsters had never seen such a lopsided result in any question they'd asked about anything. If you ask people, is the earth round or flat? You ask Americans, Pew Charitable Trust did, it's 80-10 with 10% undecided. So, I mean, 97-2 is crazy stuff. Does everyone follow that? Like when push comes to shove, do they still protect the values in the Declaration? No, but it's hardwired into us. Most of us, that's who we're supposed to be, and that's something you can work with. So we developed a one-page, what communications people call a core narrative frame, as based on the Declaration's values, defining the purpose of the United States, who belongs, the meaning of our history, where we came from, and where we ought to be going. And it's the tradition that, Frederick Douglass was arguing for in every single speech he made. These are good ideals. You Americans are betraying them. I, Frederick Douglass, can tell you that because I just escaped from slavery, and it is sucks and is not with your ideals. Do something about it. And it's Lincoln at Gettysburg. It's Martin Luther King Jr. at the mall, right? It's the things that really inspire Americans. So if your listeners are interested, that's at nationhoodlab.org too. There's a 10-page report with a one-pager in it, describing all of this stuff and laying it out that you'll find.
But
there.
Also in the book, you have the data as well as
all there in the book too. Yeah. And the book unpacks it in even more detail than you'll find in the website.
You have the actual female 52 American Indian independent, her answer, male white Republican, he's in lower management, living in greater Appalachia, his answer to the question. But and for that reason alone, that last chapter alone is worth reading and learning about. But the one question I want to ask you finally is a question I've asked a lot of real smart people who, generally speaking, have a good understanding of history. And I haven't gotten an answer. Well, the question is, when was the last time Americans had to make a shared sacrifice? My answer that I've come up with based on asking a lot of smart people is World War II. You could talk about regional natural disasters and terrorist attacks like 9/11, which I lived in New York City and lived through and lost friends. And so I know that there was this but it wasn't really a sacrifice. No one was really giving anything up. And so I think more evidence, sadly, to this argument, which I wish weren't true, but I believe it to be, is COVID. No one was willing in this country to do much. A lot of people were not willing to wear a mask, to get vaccinated, to support, each other in all kinds of ways. So do you think there has been a shared sacrifice in this country on a large scale since World War II, a communal effort to overcome some challenge or another?
I mean, we're fortunate in our history that, the last time that all of us, like the entire population, was in a group effort against a threat or something that had to be overcome was the Second World War. And it's certainly the Civil War, except we were broken into two sides. And in some sense, trying to recover from the Depression before World War II began. That created an environment where there was this extended communitarian period in our policy, call it the Greater New Deal era, but it's not just FDR in the 30s and 40s. It's Truman and Eisenhower's two terms, Republican president, former commander of the Allied forces in Europe, who knew that up against the Soviet Union, we needed to have our troops not be sick, so to speak, that we have our country together, investing in basic science, interstate highways, public universities. Those things paid off enormously, even as in that time period they were excluding, people who weren't white from the equation. But for the people it was providing for, it created a much more equal society. There were extremely high taxes on the incredibly wealthy people, a marginal tax rate on the Eisenhower administration with a Republican Congress of 91% on, once you get above the top level. That would knock down Elon Musk's fortune pretty quickly and give you a lot of resources. But I think we're at 37 today. So a totally different world. And the reason that was able to happen is there had been that shared experience of suffering, sacrifice, and group effort to recover in both the Depression and fighting the Second World War, and an understanding that there was a existential threat from the Soviet Union that meant we had to keep our act together. So not since then, no. But, different people, like New York City, I think in 9/11 experienced a shared struggle that affected the people of New York, and maybe DC with the Pentagon. I wasn't there when in the aftermath of that. Vietnam, for the people who had to go to Vietnam. I mean, absolutely. But again, it wasn't
Yeah, but 9/11, like
right?
9/11 in New York, like what we gave up, what we sacrificed, maybe, if anything, is some freedom for security, going through metal detectors, getting our shoes checked eventually after that one dude tried to blow his shoes.
Oh, right. The shoe bomber guy.
If anything, we gave up a little. We were, but everybody wasn't on board with this, obviously. But, I think the COVID really, I mean, an alien attack right now would be really interesting to see how we would handle that. I mean, I'm being kind of.
Well, I mean, until recently, we probably all would have banded together against the existential threat. Like suddenly you have world peace as we all like turn against the aliens. But these days, no, there'll probably be like, somebody will find a market share in convincing people that the aliens are our friends, the government's the enemy.
Yes.
Side with the aliens, quick.
Yes. How do I do that? How do I be the man to create that and find that market share?
Exactly. You'll have influencers. There'll be some guy on a network, who builds a whole brand around that and get zillions of followers. And
look, you got to talk to these aliens a little bit. I was just on one of the ships.
Right. If Musk visited the ship and has a deal with them, then Grok will start spitting out AI stuff that's pro-alien. I mean, yeah, we're not in great civic shape right now.
That is the greatest understatement of this entire conversation, sir. I really appreciate having you here and all of your work. This book is so fascinating and so relevant and illustrative. It really helped understand so much about how we got to where we got. And I wish that people across the political spectrum would look at this book and your work and think about it, because I don't think it indicts anybody's moral beliefs. I think it kind of just says, this is how we got here. This is why you think the way you.
Yeah, it's not partisan. Like the battle here is not like Republicans versus Democrats or liberals versus conservatives. I mean, the battle we're in now is like, do you want to live in a free society or an authoritarian one? And the answer when people are asked that question is like 70% of us anyway want to live in a free society. And that cuts across all those other categories. It's just we have to kind of realize the stakes and stand up for those ideals that most of us agree in.
Free for me and my friends. Maybe not so free for you and all your main people. You
if the Declaration though holds, because the Declaration has these like everyone, right? Every Homo sapiens has been granted by God or the universe these rights. That's the key bit in it all.
Yeah.
So if you like at least feel as though you should agree with that, it gets really hard to.
You should have said in the question, even the undocumented.
Right. Well, I mean, you're pointing to the whole effort to square the Declaration with a ethno-nationalist regime is always, okay, if all humans have these rights, then I'm gonna make more exclusive who is and isn't human, right? You make other people subhuman. That's the danger in it all. But let's not go there.
Let's not. But when asked, Supreme Court justices always said that, which was it, amendment covered undocumented people as well. I mean, Scalia famously said this. It's now
the Constitution and the Declaration. Yeah, those are universal rights. If anyone's in the United States, an Australian tourist, has habeas corpus and has the rights of free speech and all that. It's only in the past few months that anyone thought otherwise. So yeah, I mean,
yeah. Well said.
I would expect to have the same legal rights when I went to Britain or France as the British or French people, not to vote, but to like, say things and stuff. But
well, now we've gotten to the last right that Reagan afforded undocumented people was that they would get care in the emergency room. And it would seem, if you cut through all the bullshit, that that's part of why the Republicans are trying very hard to bend over backwards, saying Democrats want to give undocumented people health care. If anything, we want to give undocumented people emergency care, which is not health care, but that's a Reagan thing. And more importantly, what are you going to do? You don't check people's ID when they come in and their arm is like, this is, but that's, I think a lot of Americans, if asked, would say if an undocumented person comes in and they're bleeding out, should they be given care? I think they might say no. I don't know.
Well, those are human morality questions, right? Yeah. How much do you care about your fellow human or not? And yeah, those are getting to fundamental values.
Thank you. My fundamental value is taking people way over the time I asked them for, and I did it to you. You're welcome. Nations apart.
Even Xfinity couldn't stop us. So
even Xfinity could not stop us. They tried every time we mentioned COVID, but no, we got it all in. Colin, congrats on the new book. I hope everybody goes and gets it. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank everybody for watching live. Really appreciate it. And I'll be back at 3 with Sam Youngman. Colin, I'll say goodbye, but saying goodbye to everybody. Ending stream now. Bye.
that's